Natural Habitat Adventures is pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, Photographing Bears in the Wild. And we're joined today by Justin Gibson. And before I turn it over to Justin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about him. At the age of 8, Justin saw his first bear in the wild. And more than 20 years later, his infatuation with all things earth sign continues to grow. While attending the University of Alaska Anchorage, he spent summers as a ranger in Katmai National Park, and he's since guided countless visitors into the Alaskan wilderness for more than 12 years. Most recently, Justin has been guiding polar bear expeditions in Churchill, Manitoba. He is a self-described eco-nerd, fascinated with wildlife, botany, microbiology, birding, glaciology, and scuba diving. And we are delighted to have Justin here with us today. Hi, Justin. Welcome.
Hey, thank you very much, Lee.
Thanks for being here. We're excited to hear what you have to tell us today about photographing bears in the wild.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Technology is amazing that we can all do this, and all over the world. As Lee was saying, I did see my first bear when I was about 8 years old in Colorado, but it wasn't just a random faraway encounter. I was actually fishing in a little stocked pond a few hours from my house, and my mother and little sister were on the other side of the little lake, and I was just fishing. I really enjoyed that when I was a kid, and I felt something touch my back. I looked back and I just thought it was a black dog, but just like a lot of the cartoons, you kind of do a double take and your eyes pop out of your head a little bit. On that double take, I realized that it was a black bear. It was a black bear cub, just kicked out from its mom, so officially a subadult. But it was just kind of lost for direction. I think it had just lost its mom a few days earlier, and so it just it sat down a few yards from me and just didn't really know what to do. Now my mother happens to be, in my opinion, one of the best mothers on earth, but not today, not that day. She took my sister and ran up the hill, leaving me alone with this bear. Just instinct, I guess. But luckily for me, that bear just sat there for a while and then moved off. And ever since then, I've been infatuated with all things bear, as Lee mentioned. So the first thing, as soon as I was able to, I moved to Alaska and went to the University of Alaska in Anchorage with the sole purpose, my sole objective was to be around bears in the summer. And so I became a park ranger. My first year I was a volunteer ranger. 1 out of 1,000 applicants actually got to be in that position, and there were only about 10 available positions per year in Katmai National Park at Brooks Camp. And I think pretty much the only reason that I was able to do that is because I called every day. And I always like to joke that they finally just got sick of me and decided to let me in. So I was a park ranger for 3 years, interpretive ranger for 2 of those, and a volunteer for the first. And essentially just educating people about brown bears. Of course, I was educating myself as well during that time. And then shortly thereafter, the very next summer, after those first 3 years, I decided I wanted to go into the public sector. I really enjoyed the guiding aspect of it and the education aspect of it. And so I started guiding on the coast of Katmai National Park around these beautiful brown bears. By the way, brown bears, grizzly bears, Kodiak bears, they're all the same species. And if you want to know more about that, you can certainly ask about that. But I guided for on the coast of Katmai, and I've been guiding, that same coast for now 10 years. And a lot of my clients happen to be professional photographers. Some of them do their own kind of photo workshops and things like that. So they would focus on the photography aspect of it, teaching as they go. My job was to keep them safe from bears and get them in that perfect position. Now, years and years of this, I slowly started to get a camera and shoot beside them, and then take it from there. 10 years after my first guiding job, NatHab hired me, initially just for polar bears, but now Alaska and a little bit beyond. I've been very fortunate. Polar bears are a magnificent addition to, my bear guiding knowledge. So that's always been exciting. Now, the thing is with these bears, it's a really good time to have this conversation, because black bears and the brown bears throughout North America are pretty much, they're all out of hibernation, and they're on their way. I think in Alaska we're starting to see a lot more bears in the news and things like that. So it's a perfect time to do this talk. And even you guys as we Alaskans like to call the lower 48, maybe you'll start to see black bears in your yards or in your parks. And so it's a really good time to give this talk. The first thing that I always like to point out to my clients is that bears have some of the most scenic and beautiful ecosystem in the world. This in particular picture was taken from a float plane, and if you've never done that, I highly recommend it. It gives you a very different view, and also a big understanding of how vast and remote their ecosystem truly is. They also share their world with a host of remarkable species. This picture was taken in Alaska with a couple of tundra swans with Mount Sanford in the background. And oftentimes on this lake, you can see bears sniffing their way through as they go up into the tributaries for salmon. Of course, they also share in many places in North America. They share their world with wolves as well, and sometimes even compete. So when you go and you're looking for these bears on our trips or on your own, be prepared to take some photographs with other animals. The North American bear species, family anyway, share their home with 5 species of deer: elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, caribou, and moose. And so that's always and actually a fairly big resource for them as well. And of course, the red fox is also around, both with black bears and brown bears. And of course, they oftentimes can be seen in Churchill as well when we're looking for polar bears, and countless other animals that make their world fascinating to experience. But along with it being a very uniquely beautiful environment, the bears' world can also be some of the most extreme. Temperatures can reach as low as 60 below zero Fahrenheit. They often have to cross valley upon valley of exhausting, calorie-burning swamps and wetland. And of course, months of barren landscape, void of food sources. In the winter months, black bears and brown bears, they often really have nothing to eat, and that's actually one of the reasons why they hibernate. In San Francisco, back before they were eradicated, some brown bears actually would stay up for all 12 months of the year because there was enough food source, and of course it was a little more temperate climate as well. Conversely, it's not the winter that makes polar bears void of food. It's the cost of movement for them. So they're very good at sitting still in one place for a long period of time and waiting for that seal to pop up through its breathing hole. Now in the summer months, it's just too hot for them to really do anything, and so it's quite a difference for them. And of course, hurricane force winds. The bear family, the North American bear family, really have to deal with a lot. And essentially, they use their sense of smell more than any other scent. And so with hurricane force winds, you can tell that could be very stressful. They don't know, maybe there's a bigger bear close by, and they're really stressed out by that. So the bear family really is truly an amazing, strong, and fascinating animal, very unique to this world. Unfortunately for us, we're able to spend a small portion of the time while we watch them at their best, whether that be feeding, in this case salmon at Brooks Falls. Right underneath the falls is a nice little pool where they can actually feel those salmon hit their chest, and they're able to pop their head down and get it. So it's really unique to watch these bears and their different feeding tactics. Usually those feeding tactics are taken from their mothers. They learn everything from their mothers. But of course, as they get more dominant, they might be able to change some of the way that they fish based on that hierarchy. So we actually get to see that. Of course, mating and raising young. It's amazing to watch this. Bears happen to be a very intelligent animal, and with intelligence comes a huge curiosity. And to watch the cubs, who are obviously very curious about everything in the world, they play with everything, and to watch that is also really special. We also get to watch them honing in on their fighting skills for a number of reasons. To watch a couple of subadult or teenage brown bears or black bears sparring to kind of hone in those fighting skills for when they have to mate, or in this case with polar bears. These are adult polar bears which are sparring, which is rare in the bear world to see adults sparring like that, just for fun. And essentially they're doing it for a couple of reasons. They're doing it because they're bored a little bit, but also they can sense that the ice is coming back, in which, at that time they can go out on the ice and hunt seals. So they want to make sure that they're limber, that they have a little more muscle than they had just sitting all summer waiting for that ice to come back. And even watching their brief moments of relaxation, which is a rare thing in the bear world during their prime moments, for brown bears in the summer. It's just really nice to kind of take a break. When you're watching bears and from a long distance away, you really can't get that intimate with them. But on these trips with natural habitat, you actually do sometimes get that opportunity, which I think is really rare and special. And because some of these moments are so rare and fantastic, many of us want proof, kind of tools to help those memories stay nearly as vivid as they were in that moment. Hence the photograph, hence this lecture. Next, I'd like to dabble just a little bit about photo gear before moving on to kind of helpful techniques and tips. Most of my trips with bears, I only carry 2 lenses. I carry a wide-angle lens, to kind of get those landscape shots or bears in the environment, which I think are very powerful. We'll go over that a little bit more. And then also a zoom lens, or at least a lens with a fairly large telescopic range. So oftentimes with bears, I think it's necessary to have kind of a 300 millimeter or more capability. So a 70 to 300 millimeter lens is a pretty good option. Also, a 300 millimeter or a 400 millimeter fixed lens is a really good lens to take as well. 2 or 3 batteries for sure. You definitely don't want to be caught out there, and you're watching something fantastic and find out that your batteries are dead. And so that goes also for memory cards as well. Of course, a lot of us can remember when digital was not an option, and I definitely remember taking photos when it was either 24 or 36 exposures with the film. In my case, I was using slide film, and just missing a whole host of opportunities. But luckily, we're in a different age now, and so there's really no reason not to buy a few of these cards to have them in your possession. Also, not imaged on here would be an extender. So to make like a 1.4 extender or something like that. So it gives you a little more range onto your lens. So if there's something that's going on that's really fantastic, but it's a little too far for your 300 millimeter or 400 millimeter lens, you can always throw on that extender to give it a little bit of a boost, a 1.4 or a 2-time extender. Now, of course, all this stuff is a little pricey. It doesn't have to be very expensive. The lens in the middle there is a Nikon lens, 70 to 300 millimeter. And that lens, I think you can pick up for maybe $150 or $200. Now, of course, it's not going to be quite as sharp as some of the professional lenses that can range anywhere from $1,000 to $6,000. One beautiful thing that is fairly recent, it's a fairly recent trend, is that you can actually rent these lenses and even cameras, very high quality professional cameras as well, from certain sites or even some of your local photography shops now. So if you're only doing a wildlife trip once a year or once every 10 years, there's no reason to really spend 10, 13, 15,000 grand on some of this gear. So I recommend highly to kind of look into that rental option, and it'll give you a lot more to play with at a very low cost. Also, if possible, 2 cameras is great for these trips, because then you're not having to spend a lot of time switching between lenses. Switching between lenses can cause actually a lot of dust in the sensor, so little spots on your pictures. But also you might be able to well, if you didn't have 2 cameras, sometimes you actually miss some of that action. If you're trying to switch between a wide angle, if there's a bear that got closer than you'd expect, and you're trying to switch to the wide angle or something like that, you can oftentimes miss the action. And 2 cameras is a pretty good way to keep that from happening. The first thing that I always teach my clients about taking a good photograph is something commonly dubbed as the rule of thirds. Here's a picture of one of our great NatHab guides, Eric Rock, as he teaches this technique in Denali National Park. And it was a really good time to do this technique, because actually just behind him is Denali, and so that's always special. The basic principle behind the rule of thirds is to imagine an image broken down into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, essentially 9 fairly equal parts in that photograph. This grid now identifies 4 important parts of that image to consider placing those points of interest. And the reason I bring this up is because studies have shown over and over that when people view images, their eyes usually go to one of those 4 intersecting points more naturally than they do to the center. I couldn't tell you why, but I agree with that, because I feel the same. So this beautiful female bear in Denali National Park has her eyes purposely placed on one of those intersections. This actually gives the viewers and the bear some breathing room, so to speak. Now, of course, rules are meant to be broken. So once you get in that habit of using the rule of thirds, feel free to intentionally break it if need be. I think this image is a lot more powerful with the bear right in the middle, kind of staring at us with the snow falling in the background. The other, in my opinion, even more important rule is to give your subject a place to move. If we look at this this fairly poorly photoshopped image that I made of this bear, kind of flipped around, we might ask ourselves, well, where is he going? What's the purpose of his movement? I can tell where he's been, but it actually, personally for me, it frustrates me with curiosity, just wanting to know a little bit more about this animal, about this image that was otherwise fairly powerful. So in the real image, he has plenty of place to walk, into the shot. It tells a little bit more about the story. In miles and miles of low tide, he's searching for food while he's waiting for that ice to freeze up. And so we at least know that what he'll encounter for the next few steps. And if you have the gear to do it, like we were talking about, I always encourage clients to both zoom in on the subject, but also take lots of shots zoomed out. Zooming in, of course, can be a very powerful way to display a bear's power and share unique behavior in that bear's world. In this case, this is a sockeye salmon that this bear caught. And while it was kind of thrashing around, he shook his head bears really don't like water in their ears, so they often shake their head as soon as they go under. But it can also be a really good way to put your friends and family right into the moment. You know, you can almost imagine yourself being on that back deck of the rover, like this very happy NatHab client. But if we zoom out or take a very long environmental shot, wow, you know, what a different feeling. This rover, you know, searching for bears really shows how barren the subarctic ecosystem of Churchill really is. It takes a lot of hard work to find those bears to get this kind of shot like this. You know, a fairly powerful statement and a very different image by zooming out like that. One of my favorite photographers is the famous Tom Mandelson. He's famous for taking the first, you know, kind of infamous shot of a salmon jumping into the bear's mouth at Brooks Falls, actually just to the left of this falls here. And I've guided him around a few times, and he once told me that he rarely shoots pictures of animals close up anymore. I think his favorite images are animals interacting with their environment, you know, kind of telling a much bigger story than just zooming in. If we were to zoom in on this bear, actually dubbed Funky, he's been around a long time, he's very grumpy, you know, if we zoom in just maybe on some of the little bubbles below his mouth or something like that, it tells a very different story than if we zoom out. You kind of get the Brooks Falls, you know, kind of roaring over the cliff's edge. It tells a much different story. For me, I think one of the best ways, and my favorite ways, actually something I focus on most, is to take powerful images that tell a story. A male bear will often kill a female's cubs to put her back in the heat. And I know that sounds fairly gruesome, but it's a genetic strategy that they've devised, you know, over generation and generation. So one strategy that females, or sows as they're called, is that they've taken is to make their cubs climb trees, you know, while they fish. So while they're hunting for food, their mothers are not going to be paying too much attention to them, and that's when they're very vulnerable. So the mom will often send them up a tree and just so they can wait there, sometimes for an hour or two. So this 6-month-old cub was just waiting very patiently while their mom fished. And in this case, the first year, they're not eating much meat. They'll taste it a little bit, you know, with that curiosity. But most of their food source is straight from their mother's milk. And so they'll often have to sit there for a very long time because, you know, the mom is not only going to catch those fish, but eat those fish while they're in the tree. So in this particular case, this bear almost even fell out of the tree because he was just so bored. Now, when that sow came back, the cub, you know, crawled down the tree and gave her a kiss. I think it's one of my favorite shots I've ever taken. It just shows a very different side of bears than, you know, what you read in the news or some of those, you know, those kind of horror books. Now, another kind of a powerful story is, again, a male bear will kill those cubs to put her back in the heat, but if she is in heat after, you know, 3 years of being with the mom, it's time for her to kick them out. And so what often happens is that she'll start to go back in the estrus, and it's better for her to kick those cubs out than to put them into danger by a male bear. And so They're often like that first bear that I saw. They're often very confused and lonely, and they really have no idea how to hunt. If they're lucky, they've spent a lot of time watching their mom instead of playing. But even then, it's a very difficult couple of years. And I think one thing that helps them a lot is if they have a sibling or two, they'll stick together, kind of a safety in numbers type thing. These sisters all morning were separated. A big male came in and kind of chased them around and bullied them a little bit, and they were separated all morning. And when they finally got together, this is kind of the first time that they got close again. And so they kind of stopped for a gentle greeting. And I think that that's a very powerful image that shows a different side of bears than we often see by them, catching fish or roaring or any of that stuff. So now that we know what we're looking for while photographing bears, we'll look at some more technical factors that at first seem a little daunting, but in reality can be very easily taught by any of our photo readers, really. For me, when I first started shooting, again, it was with film, a couple of years before the digital era actually started to explode. Exposure seemed to be my worst enemy. I was shooting with slide film, and I had no idea what I was really doing. I had no proper training. Luckily, we don't have that problem anymore because of that digital age. We can actually look at our pictures and evaluate them immediately. This sow was resting after being chased around for days and days by giant males while she was in estrus. So we had the opportunity to sit with her. She could finally relax. She could finally eat some grass, while she's waiting for the salmon to come in. But when I got my film back, I was certainly disappointed. One of our great guides, Brad Josephs, shared this photo with me that he actually took just about a week ago, kind of to help illustrate the difficulty in properly exposing panda bears. You can tell that they're black and white, which makes them really tricky. The camera's going to want to expose for the black or the white. So one easy trick is to get an exposure close to perfect would be to use your camera's metering system and finding something more neutral than the black or the white. In this case, maybe the trees or the tree or the leaves might be kind of a natural neutral color or light. So you lock that exposure on that neutral item, and it's called spot metering. And to spot meter, every camera is different. I would recommend reading your manual and practicing, maybe in your backyard during various weather and light conditions before a trip. But that's certainly something to focus on, and I think it'll help you considerably. Now, of course, having an LCD screen on the back of all our cameras is great, but I never use that playback for evaluating exposure. I only use it for looking at sharpness and definitely composition. The LCD can play tricks on us, and we assume the exposure is perfect until we look at the picture on a computer screen. And the reason is because outside the conditions are variable. Sometimes there's too much light hitting that LCD or it's not enough. And so there is a much more foolproof way to make sure that you're getting that right light. And it's called the histogram, which can be found on the top right there. It's found on most digital cameras, and definitely all DSLRs, and it's fairly simple to use. All we're looking for is that the peak is somewhat in the middle of that graph there. If it's crammed to one side or another, it tells us that we have to make some sort of an adjustment. Now, we won't go into much detail on exposure composition. I will say that if your histogram has that peak crammed to one side or another, the next step is to make subtle adjustments by forcing the camera to expose a little less or a little more than it thinks it should. It's essentially the easiest way to explain it. So this is actually the last step to making a correct exposure. You kind of make adjustments using this after you read your histogram. you take a shot and check your histogram again. And once it seems like it's fairly centered, your exposure should be right on. So we've gone through pretty much everything except for sharpness of images. Brad Josephs, again, is notorious for crystal clear pictures. This cute panda cub is certainly no exception. The problem is there's no real clear secret to sharpness other than a kind of a few hints and a little discipline. Typically, there are two ways a photo gets soft or blurry. Soft focus and movement during the exposure are really the culprits. So these two polar bears, these adult male polar bears, sparred in low light in Churchill last year. Two challenges that I faced in this situation is that they were moving, fairly fast, and the weather caused low light, which meant a fairly slow shutter speed. To keep up with their movement, I used manual focus, and many guides will vary on that subject. But for me, it's just easier to manual focus. I feel confident, in an intense situation that I could keep it focused. But secondly, I boosted the ISO or film speed. So, before digital, we'd go to Walmart and we'd pick up film speed 100 for a lot of light, and then 400 or 800 for softer light. And essentially, in the digital world, that's called ISO, and it has the same numbers, 100 to now 16,000 or something like that. So if you boost that ISO, then it enabled me to shoot with confidence that I was actually getting a faster shutter speed, so it wouldn't be so blurry. And lastly, camera shake, can be a big culprit for soft pictures. And I think no matter how hard we try, our hands are going to move during our photo adventures. One solid piece of advice that was given to me by fellow guide Eric Rock is to change your settings to enable multiple shots with one shutter press. We've all seen it at a sporting event or during our wildlife adventures. Most people are just clicking away, but every once in a while you'll hear a photographer just. And there's a couple of reasons for that. He doesn't want to miss that perfect second, of a bear looking at him or something like that. But also, your hands will shake when you press down that shutter. And again, when you release it. So you can imagine with one picture, there's a lot of shake in there. But with multiple shots and one press, there'll be pictures somewhere in the middle that have very little camera shake, provided your shutter speed is fast enough. And so I think that's a really good tip to use. And I think the last point that I'll make today is the most important. Don't try to photograph bears without an expert by your side. They're remarkable animals. They allow us to share their prime seasons, but without an expert, these bears will show signs of stress. And if you don't know how to read those signs, it could end tragically, either for you or the bear, or both. But as luck would have it, Natural Habitat has expert expedition leaders to really make your experience great. And here are just a few of our trips, you can go on to potentially see these bears in the wild with a leader that'll put you in the perfect position to do that. Of course, Yellowstone is famous for bears and geothermic activity and things like that. And Glacier National Park is one we go to that has a large population of black bears and grizzly bears as well. Of course, spirit bears in British Columbia is a great trip. It's kind of an anomaly, a recessive gene that these black bears go through that is, for whatever reason, just a little more common in this particular area. One of the only places in the world you can see these bears, and so I think that's a really special trip that you can take. And of course, the coast of Katmai, where I had mentioned I worked as a guide for a number of years, is a great place to get up close and personal with these bears. You're walking on their level and seeing them, either clam or fish, or eat grass or a number of other things like that. And so that's a really special trip. And the Ultimate Alaska Wildlife Safari is a really neat trip to both potentially see black bears and see brown bears fishing. Brown bears fishing at Brooks Falls, the most famous spot to see brown bears as the fish jump up that waterfall in the background there. And of course, we have China to see a very different bear from the North American bears, and 6 different ways to see polar bears, which, as it happens, will be the next webinar coming up here in a couple of weeks. So that's a wonderful trip, and it's the most unique and an easy way for us to see polar bears in the wild. And actually, surprisingly to find out, from Chicago, it's only essentially 4 hours away or so. So that's pretty special. And if you're interested in any of these trips or have any more questions, you can certainly call the NatHab Travel Desk and come join us on some of these wonderful polar bear tours.
Well, Justin, thank you. That was terrific. We've got a lot of questions here. How about we get some of those answered?
Sure, let's hear it.
Okay. So you said early on you mentioned seasons for best time to go and see bears, but there was a request here for you to give us a little bit of a recap of that. I'm sure it varies by destination, but is there a general rule of thumb?
It does vary by it does vary by destination. I think in Alaska even there's some variation, and for most of Alaska anyway, to see brown bears is going to be dictated by the salmon species and when they run. And we have 5 salmon species, 4 of which are commonly caught by bears. The king salmon is a little different because they're a little more of they're an elusive species. But June, July, August, even into September, any of those months are really good to see bears in Alaska. In Yellowstone, of course, or Glacier, they don't have that salmon source, and so it's a little more difficult to see those bears with any sort of predictability. But any time in the summer months is pretty good. September they're a little higher up, so it's a little harder. But I would say anywhere in between June and late August into September would be a really good time for that. And of course, polar bears, the only time to really see polar bears in Churchill anyway, where we go, is October and November. Essentially, they're just all gathering in a very strategic place, which happens to be Churchill, because it's the first place where the ice freezes on Hudson Bay. And so they're just waiting and waiting and waiting. And so October and November is really good. And then the ice comes in, and then all the bears leave.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to ask you, let's see, one more question here about bears, and then we've got a lot of technical questions about the specifics of photographing. And
Sure.
So there was a question about how close that you can actually get to these bears as you're taking these photos.
It just depends. And I think when you're talking about grizzlies and black bears, it depends a lot on their food source. Now, in Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks, we tend to want to keep, and Denali actually for that matter, we tend to want to keep a lot more distance because they're a lot more stressed because they don't have that salmon source. Now, say in Katmai National Park, we're able, in the case of Brooks Camp, you're actually up on platforms, and so you're able to get, essentially right above them. And on the coast of Katmai, there's usually a 50-yard rule, and so we try to keep that distance, but that's certainly closer than you can, say, a Yellowstone bear. And of course, with polar bears, you're in rovers, and so they kind of dictate how close they want to get to you.
Mm-hmm. So what about the physical demands of these sorts of trips? Is it real physically demanding? Is there a lot of hiking over difficult terrain?
I think one thing that Natural Habitat does very well is make these trips for everybody. Whether you're a teenager or a senior citizen or anywhere in between, I think that the physical aspects are not demanding enough to where it dictates whether you can or cannot go on the trip. The Coast of Katmai trip is a little bit more physically demanding because you have to kind of walk through marsh and things like that once in a while. But any of the other trips, you're able to take your time and in Brooks Camp on the Ultimate Alaska trip, the only walking you really have to do is about 1.5 miles of pretty much flat ground all the way to the falls. And I think that's probably the most walking out of all of our trips that involve bears that you would have to do.
Okay. The tours, the photo tours, would an amateur enjoy themselves on this trip, or is it mostly for professional photographers?
No, we get a good mix of both. And oftentimes we actually have, maybe a couple goes on this trip, and one person is interested in the photography, and the other one just wants to go to see these animals, and they both have a great time. And I think the way we gear the trip as far as teaching is because they're such a small group, 12 to 15 people, but we're actually able to give intermediate advice to the professionals and beginner advice to the people that just want to start out or that are renting cameras that they've never actually touched before. I think it's a really good mix.
Okay. And do you recommend using a tripod or a monopod to capture good pictures?
Yes. I recommend both. Monopod is nice, especially it's a little easier to move around, and I think in an area, for instance, like Brooks Camp, when you're watching the bears on the waterfalls, you're kind of stuck on this platform, and sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it can get a little packed, and so those tripods become more of a nuisance than anything. Of course, anything to stabilize your camera is going to be a good thing, and I would certainly recommend bringing a tripod. If not a monopod. And nowadays, they actually have tripods that you can take off the legs and turn into a monopod. So definitely all very good things.
Okay. And then here's another question. For a relative beginner, what are the 1 or 2 things they can do to improve their photos right off the bat?
Well, if you're using an SLR, I would say the biggest 2 things would be those first 2 tips. Actually, if you're not using a DSLR even, would be that rule of thirds would be a really good help. Time after time, once I teach that rule of thirds, clients are just flabbergasted at, even though they don't know why, but they really have improved those images. And then secondly, just leading into that shot, if you're doing wildlife or even sports, or your kids playing soccer, to lead the viewer into that shot and give that subject a little room to move in that space is actually will make all the difference.
Okay, good. And there was a question that says my internet connection dropped out, so I apologize if this was already addressed, but what was the minimum shutter speeds that you recommended for sharp bear photos?
No, that's a great question, and I didn't really go into any detail on that. But I think that kind of the general rule is if you're shooting with a 300 millimeter or a 70 millimeter to 300 millimeter, if you zoomed in on a 300 millimeter, is to have a 1/300th of a second exposure, or so you want to equal the millimeter that you're at. So if you have a 600 millimeter lens, you want about a 1 to 600 second shutter speed. And of course, with the ISO, with the film speed nowadays and the technology, there's no reason to not get that. You can boost that speed, the film speed up pretty high and not have a problem with graininess. So yeah, that's a general rule.
Okay. And I'm glad you talked about boosting ISO, because actually there was a question about that. Just maybe some clarification. It says boosting your ISO, does that mean using a higher number for ISO.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So again, I kind of talked about, going into Walmart before the digital era and seeing, film speeds anywhere from 100 to 800, I think is pretty much the limits we had there. And on the 100 box, there was a sunshine icon, which meant, um, for anything that's going to, whether you're on a beach or in snow and it's really bright, and then the 800 would be, very cloudy icon. And that's essentially it. In lower light conditions, you want a higher ISO or a higher film speed.
Okay, good. So what about if somebody can't afford a really fancy camera, maybe just a couple $100? Would you say that they should still take a trip like this? Can they still get good pictures with, maybe a point and shoot or even their phone?
Well, first off, you can rent a whole setup for a week for $400 or $500. But that being said, some people just aren't interested in that, and I certainly understand that. I feel like a lot of people on our trips kind of just want to experience it. And even if you can't get a good shot with, say, your phone, we certainly like to encourage all of our clients that are on that trip to share those pictures with each other. And so that really helps a lot. And in some cases, yes, the animals are close enough to where a phone would take a great shot.
Okay, very good. And, well, what about a waterproof camera? Do you think that would be something people would want to bring?
Certainly, pretty much any bear species, they live in an area where there's certainly a lot of rain. I think in Alaska, the last couple of years have fairly been, very nice, kind of an anomaly there. But yeah, certainly if they're in the market for a waterproof camera, I think it certainly can't hurt. On some of our trips, we do kind of a nice float down a glacier fed river, and so if you had that waterproof camera, you could put your camera underneath the water and get some really neat shots of icebergs and things like that too. Sure.
Okay, very good. Do you have any specific hints for photographing black bears? Their eyes seem to be very hard to capture against their dark background.
Most certainly, yeah. And it's kind of the same thing with panda bears. I think what really helps, and obviously it's a little difficult sometimes to get them to participate in this, but if you can get the bear where the sun is actually facing their eyes, then you can kind of get that catch light. I think the main focus would be to make sure that you are focusing on that eye, and that's with any animal or person. I think even if nothing else is in focus, if you have a kind of a low aperture, as long as that eye is in focus, you should be able to get some pretty good shots. And sometimes it's just not possible, but I would recommend that being as the easiest way to kind of we call it catch light for the eye.
Okay, great. So do you recommend any particular filters or polarizers for the Churchill photo tours? Does the snow background change things?
Oh, it certainly changes things. I think the biggest thing that we always have to go through with our clients is that exposure compensation, which I didn't really get into too much, but it was that once you get the histogram to one side or another, and then you can kind of compensate for that. Filters, it's usually fairly gray, like in this picture. It's usually what happens is that it's not quite cold enough to where there's no moisture in the air yet, and so it's oftentimes very gray. So a polarizer kind of it doesn't really work for much, worth much. That being said, a neutral density filter for anybody who wants to, a graduated neutral density filter for anyone who wants to kind of Google that is a really good way to, because unless it's snowy, in the background here you can see that there's still some brush there. Your sky is going to be overexposed, and so a neutral density filter, graduated neutral density filter, is a good way to get that whole picture exposed. But that's kind of a more intermediate tactics, and so make sure you Google it and kind of understand why you would want to buy that.
Okay. One more technical question, and then I'll move on to some more destination and experience type questions.
Sure.
This one says, I have a 300 millimeter prime lens with a 1.4 extender. For shooting in Alaska, would you recommend leaving the extender on or off?
I always recommend leaving them off, and the reason is because it softens the picture a little bit, and they haven't quite found a way to change that. And so if you need it, certainly put it back on, but mine stays in my bag 90% of the time, and I only take it out if I absolutely need it. Because mostly, environmental shots are just as powerful, unless there's something like maybe a bear eating a moose calf or something like that you really need that extra distance. I would recommend keeping it off, but definitely bringing it if you have it, certainly.
Okay. So let me ask you a few questions about just the experience on a typical day on a typical tour. How many times a day will guests go out, and out into the wilderness and have the opportunity to explore and perhaps see and photograph bears?
It's trip by trip. The Yellowstone and glacier trips, well, let me say that we're always out, pretty much every day, all day. We're experiencing the destination in which we're at. With Yellowstone and glacier, it really just depends. We're trying to find those animals, and they're a little harder to see than they would be in Alaska and Canada. Now in Alaska, pretty much the Katmai trip, you're with them all day, every day that you're on the trip. And then of course the ultimate Alaska trip, there's a huge itinerary that involves whale watching and seeing glaciers calve into the ocean and viewing Denali, if you're lucky enough to have it out and not clouded over. And then our last 3 days are all just watching bears catch fish at the waterfalls. And so, and with the polar bears, every day of the trip, for most of the trips are out on those rovers, in what you're seeing a picture of right now. So definitely every day, people often say they need a vacation from their vacation, because we really pack a lot in, and it's a lot of fun.
So I'm sure this next question does depend on the destination, but there's a question here from several people actually about what sort of clothing one should bring. There was one specific question about the polar bear trips, and then of course the other areas as well.
Sure. Well, in this particular picture, you can see that a lot of these people have blue parkas. And those blue parkas have since been upgraded, and we actually, by the way, gave away those blue parkas to a homeless shelter in Winnipeg, which was really nice. So when you get there, there's a place called Boots and Parkas Room in the hotel in Winnipeg that we all stay at, and you're able to go in there and actually get Arctic boots and Arctic jackets. And so all you really need to do is make sure you have warm pants and a nice beanie and maybe some gloves. And I think that's, for the polar bear expedition, that's pretty much all you need as far as clothing goes. Now with the other trips, they're all fairly similar weather-wise, Yellowstone, Glacier, and Alaska, in that, it can be very cold, but it can also be very hot. And the trick to those kind of environments is to dress in layers. So a t-shirt and maybe a fleece, and then maybe have a bigger coat and a hat and some gloves, light gloves during that time, definitely. But I think layers is definitely the trick to those kind of, and a rain jacket for sure, rain gear.
Okay. All right. Let me make this the last question, and then I'll turn it back over to you for closing comments. So there's a question here about whether this or other vacations would be appropriate for multi-generational or kids. And So maybe you could just talk a little bit about whether the photography trips are good for that sort of travel, or whether there may be other options that would be more appropriate.
I think if you're doing a kind of a family trip and you have um, maybe a 12-year-old and and a 16-year-old and mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, the photo trips can be good as long as everyone has kind of a general interest in the photography. But if not, most of our photo trips have counterparts that aren't really based on the photography. They're more of a generalized trip that really doesn't focus on the technicalities of photography, but kind of the same itinerary. But yes, our trips with the wildlife are actually great for kids as long as those kids are mature. If there's a 12-year-old or younger that is going to see a bear and scream at it or something, certainly we're not interested in that. But I think most of the kids we get are really really good kids that are just fascinated by nature and fascinated with these beautiful animals. And so I think the family trips that I've led and the guides that I've talked to, they just have a blast. And actually some of our favorite clients have been families.
Okay. Well, thank you, Justin. So let me just turn it back over to you for closing comments at this point. It sure has been really interesting, everything you've had to share today, and can't believe we're already at the end of our hour together. So let me give it back to you.
Yeah, time certainly flew by. I will thank you guys for joining on this webinar. It's pretty fun, and for me to get to talk about bears always is good. But considering that we're ramping up, the season, and bears are getting ready to start feeding on salmon and things like that, it was really my pleasure to be a part of this. I want to recommend that you guys be safe around bears, and if you don't have an expert, then keep your distance, and definitely follow up on some of this, the climate change and the hunting regulations within Alaska and Canada, because it's certainly ongoing that it changes, and a lot of those changes are for the worse. And so it's always important to, if obviously you're here, you care enough about it to keep posted on that, and maybe talk to your congressman or woman about some of these changes, and express some concern if you need to. But thank you very much for joining. I had a great time. Thank you.
My thanks as well, and we appreciate having all of you here with us. And if you want to go deep and learn more about the Bears of Churchill, that's what we'll be talking about in just a couple of weeks. So if you haven't signed up for that, we would encourage you to do so, and you can refer back to the email that you used to sign up for this one. So with that, we thank you very much, and we'll say good day and conclude our webinar. Goodbye, everybody.